Without further ado, let's move on to Peter Gleick. So Peter is Director Emeritus of the Pacific Institute with a focus on the environment and global sustainability. He is an international leader, innovator, and communicator on global water and climate issues, and a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Gleick's work has redefined water from the realm of engineers to the world of sustainability, human rights, and integrated thinking. He has pioneered the concept of a soft path for better managing the world's water. And his speech today is about global water scarcity.
Welcome. My name is Peter Gleick. I'm delighted to be able to offer a presentation to you today about, in my case, the issue of global water resources. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to participate. When we're done, hopefully there will be an opportunity for a little bit of back and forth, perhaps some Q&A, but we'll see. Let me begin by sharing my screen here. I'm going to talk about the world water crisis. Many of my comments will be relevant for other resources as well: energy, forestry, agriculture, biodiversity. My focus and my experience is on water and the issue of climate change. Water is connected to everything we care about, and I'll use it in a sense as a proxy to talk about global resources in general. We live on a water planet, but very little of the world's water resources are fresh. Very few of the water resources on the planet are available and accessible to humans. That big blue dot is the total volume of water on the planet. The smaller blue dot is the amount of fresh water on the planet. And it's a tiny fraction of the total water available, and even a tiny fraction of those water resources are accessible to humans. What I'll be doing is describing the nature of the world's water problems, and I'll also describe a path forward to solve them. In terms of the global water crisis, there are many pieces to this, of course, but for me, the most serious, the worst, and in many ways the most inexcusable problem is the failure to provide safe water and sanitation for billions of people. It's the 21st century, and yet huge numbers of people on the planet still lack access to the most basic fresh water and most basic sanitation services. And these people live in what we describe as water poverty, the result of society's failure to spend the money required to apply technology that we well understand and to make the fundamental commitment to provide safe water and sanitation for all. Among the worst consequences of that failure is water-related diseases. There are millions of cases of preventable water-related diseases every year: cholera, dysentery, parasitic diseases like schistosomiasis and guinea worm, and millions of cases of preventable deaths, many of which are children under the age of 5. But this isn't just a problem in developing countries. Even in the richer countries of the world, we have populations without access to clean, safe, affordable water. This is Flint, Michigan, where thousands of people were exposed to lead and other contaminants after a failure of the water system and the failure of their local governments. And this isn't just a problem in cities. In California, hundreds of thousands of people lack access to safe water and sanitation, almost all in disadvantaged, primarily Latino communities in the Central Valley, exposed to agricultural chemicals, high salinity, and again, a failure of governments to provide safe and affordable water services that most of us take for granted. Another part of the world's water crisis is the massive contamination of our freshwater systems with industrial and human wastes. The start of the environmental movement in the United States was in part to protect water resources. Here, the Cuyahoga River catching fire in 1969, which captured the imagination of the American public. This is actually a photograph from a previous incident when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire in 1952. But these kinds of incidences led in many ways to the public movement for clean water in the United States. It led to the passage of the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act in the 60s and 70s. But even those efforts to clean things up failed to solve our water problems today. Even today, we have toxic algal blooms. We have new drinking water contaminants appearing in Lake Erie, for example, again, where the Cuyahoga River ends. Of just a few years ago, a problem with toxic algal blooms led to the closure of the water supply for the city of Toledo, Ohio. And we continue to have serious water quality problems around the world in different forms, in different places, and at different times. Without water, we don't have food. 80% of the water that humans use goes to the agricultural sector, and a substantial portion of these water resources come from unsustainable groundwater overdraft. By some estimates, 30 to 40% of today's production of global food comes from water resources that come from unsustainable sources of groundwater overdraft. This cannot continue. And yet we have to grow more food for more people in the future, or get better about what we grow and how we grow it and where we grow it, and how the world's food system delivers what we grow to hungry mouths. In many ways, the food problem we face is itself a water problem. And many of our worst ecological problems are associated again with our use of fresh water. Freshwater ecosystems cover less than 1% of the Earth's surface, but they contain a third of known vertebrates, including 40% of fish species around the world. The Freshwater Living Planet Index, a measure of the health of freshwater ecosystems representing nearly 3,400 species of birds, fish, amphibians, mammals, and reptiles, has declined by 83% since 1970, a collapse described by some as catastrophic. 80 different freshwater fish species have gone extinct, and disturbingly enough, 16 of them in just the last year. Another indication of the incredible importance of fresh water for ecosystem health and biodiversity, and yet the vulnerability of our ecosystems to the way humans take water out of those freshwater systems. Water is also a political issue. Half of the land area of the planet is in what we call an international river basin, a river shared by 2 or more countries. Growing water scarcity means growing tensions over water. And this graph comes from the Water Conflict Chronology, an open source database that we maintain at the Pacific Institute, showing recent trends in water conflicts around the world from 1980 up until 2019. And it shows, first of all, a tremendous increase in the number of water conflicts that occur each year. But it also shows the kinds of conflicts that we're seeing. Conflicts started where water is a trigger of conflict, the blue chart, or where water are targets or casualties of conflict in red, or where water systems have been a weapon of conflict in green. And in all of these cases, we see a dramatic increase in the number of conflicts over water resources in recent years. And of course, we know we're changing the climate. The science is strong. Every professional scientific organization on the planet, every National Academy of Sciences on the planet acknowledges that humans are changing the climate. Other talks here will focus on the issue of climate change in much more detail, but let me note that among the worst impacts of human-caused climate change will be impacts on water resources, changes in water availability and quality, changes in rainfall events and evaporation rates as temperatures go up, changes in extreme events, including floods and droughts. And this isn't a future problem. This is already a problem for today. These impacts are being observed as already. And there's another piece to this as well. Water is very closely tied to energy. It takes water to produce the energy we use. It takes energy to produce and clean and distribute the water resources that we use. And we must reduce the energy and greenhouse gas footprint of our water system while also preparing to deal with the now unavoidable consequences of climate change. Those impacts we can no longer avoid. As a note in this area, natural catastrophes are on the rise. This is a graph that shows the total number of natural catastrophes worldwide, broken out by hydrologic events, those related to our water resources, meteorological events in green, related to extreme weather events like floods and droughts and storms, climatological events, and then at the bottom, geophysical events. The vast majority of these natural catastrophes are in some ways related to both the climate and to our water resources. Swiss Re, which provides these data and is one of the major reinsurance companies on the planet, notes, quote, "The only plausible explanation for the rise in weather-related catastrophes is climate change," end of quote. But let me also talk in the context of dealing with the global crisis around water to the issue of solutions and what I call the soft path. I'd like to offer some thoughts about how we can solve our water-related problems. My work has focused on defining what I call the soft path for water, a new way of thinking in an integrated way about tackling freshwater challenges. There are many components of this, but part of the key point here is that there is an alternative way forward. There is a way to solve our water crises and to move forward to a more sustainable future. And let me describe what I mean by the soft path for water. The hard path, which is the way we have dealt with water in the past century, is build for water supply, find more water supply, take more water out of our rivers, out of our ecosystems, out of our groundwater systems, and build hard infrastructure. The soft path says rethink water supply, find new sources of water, new sources of supply that don't require more damaging extraction of water from our natural ecosystems. The hard path said satisfy projected demand, find new sources of supply to satisfy some assumption about ever-increasing demand for water. But the soft path says rethink water demand. And I'll talk about this in a little more detail. The hard path says water is an economic good and only an economic good. But the soft path says water is an economic good and a human right. The hard path says build centralized water treatment systems and produce only one quality of water, potable water, when the soft path says protect water quality and match the quality of supply to the quality of the need. We don't need potable water, for example, to water our lawns. We don't need potable water quality to flush our toilets. And some might argue we don't even need lawns at all. But match water quality, the quality of the water that we have with the quality of the water that we need. The hard path gives no thought to ecosystems, to ecosystem water needs, or to ecosystem health. The soft path says protect ecosystem needs, protect ecosystem health. And the hard path is a path where we have centralized management and limited public participation. But the soft path calls for community participation about how we manage our water resources, flexible water institutions. These differences are critical for moving forward. And here's what they mean. They mean provide for the human right to water. And think about water not just as an economic good, but as a human right. The UN declared a human right to water in 2010, and we're making progress on meeting water and sanitation goals under the Sustainable Development Goals. But we must do much more to provide safe and affordable water for all. The failure to meet basic needs isn't a technology problem. It's not an economic problem. We know how and we have the money, but we have failed to mobilize the resources. We need to think differently about supply, not new demands, not aqueducts, not groundwater extraction, but wastewater treatment and reuse, stormwater capture, and appropriate desalination. We have to rethink water demand. We need to be much more efficient in the way we use the water we're already extracting from the system. There's a massive opportunity to improve the efficiency of water use. Let's produce more of what we want with less water. And this is true for agriculture. Let's grow more food with less water, with improved irrigation efficiency, improved soil moisture monitoring, improved crop choices. We must acknowledge the value of ecosystems, even when our traditional economic system has failed to do so. For water, one approach is the restoration of natural flowing rivers, including guaranteeing minimum flows and removing dams. This is the Elwha Dam on the Elwha River in the Pacific Northwest, the largest dam removal project in the United States. And this is that river after that dam was removed in 2014 and 2015. And salmon fisheries on the Elwha River are now being restored. And we need better institutions. We have to change our institutions. Nelson Mandela said, in the context of water, quote, "It's one thing to find fault with an existing system. It's another thing altogether, a more difficult task to replace it with another approach that is better." That means managing our water resources and our energy resources and our biodiversity systems with different kinds of institutions, managing for sustainability, not for extraction, for equity, not for exclusion. Some final thoughts. The freshwater crisis is real and it's bad. There are human, economic, and environmental costs to inaction. Not everything is getting worse, and we need new thinking. We need solutions that are sustainable, scalable, and socially responsible. We need new technologies or better application of existing technologies. We need better economics or better application of economics. And we need smarter, more integrated institutions. And finally, new actions, commitments, partnerships, and communications and outreach can move us in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for this really interesting talk about water. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions now. So the first question I'd like to ask is about the system that we live in. So in The Big Short in 2015, a film about the subprime market crisis, we were introduced to Michael Burry, who was the investor who detected the problem years before the financial crisis happened. And it is revealed at the end that this person, Michael Burry, is now investing, focusing all his trading on just one commodity, and that's water. So as water becomes more scarce, do you think the capitalist system in which we live will also assign more value to it? And what are your thoughts on this? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Yes, thank you very much. So people keep telling me to watch that movie. I haven't seen it. But of course, the idea that water is increasingly a commodity, it's no longer a public good, as in fact, we had a little conversation right before this about how to make some of these goods more public versus private, but is increasingly a private commodity is a challenge. And of course, we saw this with bottled water, where private companies have managed to turn a public resource into a private commodity and sell it back to us at an enormous markup in price. And I think that's part of the challenge. We have to understand how to balance the idea that water is an economic good, that we pay for water services. I want tap water of incredibly great potable quality coming out of my tap. I want my wastewater magically taken away from me when I flush the toilet. And I'm willing to pay for that. But at the same time, water is literally a human right. As I mentioned in my talk, the UN declared a human right to water in 2010. We're not quite sure how to implement that. But it's clear that the failure to meet basic needs for fundamental water services, for safe, affordable water, and for safe sanitation systems is not available to everyone worldwide and should not be it should not be a requirement that there be an economic cost that people have to pay for that because for reasons of poverty, they're unable to pay for that. So balancing this water is an economic good. It's a service we should be willing to pay for, and yet it's also a human right, is one of the challenges in moving forward to a more sustainable system.
What an interesting dynamic between the two concepts. So I really thought that your soft path to water was a really interesting concept. And when you did mention water as a human right, did you envision that it would be individual governments' responsibility to provide adequate infrastructure to their population, or do you envision a different model?
Yeah, so that's another great question. And interestingly enough, it gets back to the conversation we were having right before this. I talk about the global water crisis and I describe different aspects of it, but in many ways, water is a local issue. You know, if I save water here in my home in California, that doesn't help anyone in sub-Saharan Africa that doesn't have water services. Water is often a local issue, and it's too expensive to move water very far from one place around the world to another. And so we do depend on local institutions. We do depend on smart, sustainable management of water resources and energy resources locally. But there are concepts around sustainable water management that I think are global in terms of the human right to water, in terms of protecting natural ecosystems. And so we have to think about local water systems and making local water systems more sustainable themselves, more resilient to the kinds of climate changes that we know are happening. But we also have to think about how, as a global community, to provide water and water services to those communities or those institutions that are weak around the world that need to be strengthened in a consistent fashion.
Agreed. So it's very easy to see what the problem is when the nation state is failing to provide infrastructure in poor countries. But what about the wealthy countries? Like the example of Flint, Michigan springs to mind, and you mentioned it in your talk. Why do you think it is that governments, wealthy governments, fail to provide drinking water to their population?
Well, the story in Flint was a story of government failure. It was a failure to understand how a change in a water source might affect the chemistry and might affect the quality of the water delivered to the community there. It was a minority, low-income community, which often gets far less attention from governments than they should because of discrimination and ethical failures. There was no excuse for what happened in Flint in a country like the United States. There's no excuse for our continued failure to provide safe water for communities in the Central Valley of California that we know have had bad water quality and lack of access to water for decades, and yet we have failed to meet those responsibilities. It's one thing when you look in sub-Saharan Africa where governments have commitments for communications and transportation and education and healthcare that they're unable to meet. It's a little easier to understand water failures in places like that. But in a place like Western Europe or the United States or Canada, those kinds of failures are inexcusable. And at the same time, there's an opportunity for the richer countries of the world to help developing regions that don't have access to the economic resources or the technology to meet their basic needs for water, to provide that assistance. Absolutely. The amount of money required to meet basic needs for water and sanitation for everyone on the planet is far less than the economic costs of failing to meet those needs.
Yes, that's right. So in one of the strategies that you explain in your soft path to water is that we could try and decentralize the management of water and transition to community participation. How do you envision that working?
Yeah, so a good example of that is, so in the developed world, we've built these sophisticated water systems and we collect our wastewater in big centralized wastewater treatment plants. And we treat that water often to a very high standard. And then often we throw that water away. It's dumped into the ocean. If we had decentralized water treatment systems, for example, and the technology permits us to do this now, we could collect, for example, wastewater in local communities, treat it to a very high standard, and reuse it in those local communities. It would require a more decentralized model of wastewater treatment than traditionally we've invested in. But the technology to do that exists now. And that's an option for many places in the world that have not made the big investment in centralized wastewater treatment. Let's make investments in decentralized systems where we collect locally wastewater, we treat that to a very high standard, and we can reuse that water locally. It's again, partly an answer to your earlier question about local systems and local institutions that are a little bit different than the kinds of institutions we built and relied on in the 20th century.
How interesting, because I've been wondering throughout this entire day of talks about the tension between finding solutions at nation state level versus international level versus community level. And so it seems like if the nation state is not able to provide the quality of water that is needed at country level, perhaps there's something that the communities can do to take to provide it instead.
This gets back exactly to the very last quote from Nelson Mandela, who was referring to this, that the systems we built in the 20th century, the institutions, the technology for water specifically, they brought enormous benefits to us. And we have to acknowledge those. But we also have to acknowledge that they haven't brought benefits to everyone, and that there are new ways of thinking. There are new kinds of institutions. There are new kinds of technologies that can bring the benefits that we want to the communities that have not yet received them.
Yes, and I think also beyond logistics, there's also perhaps a question of political will. So when, for example, the US started to say that they would remove themselves from the Paris Agreement, I noticed that cities and states around the U.S. started signing the Paris Agreement on their on their own. So, for example, I think California signed the Paris Agreement when the U.S. started saying that they wouldn't. So perhaps that is something that we can explore further, perhaps even in the plenary tomorrow. At what level should activism and commitments to change take place? Is it individual? Is it a community level? Is it a state or region level? Or is it international or nation state or all of the above?
It's a great question, worthy of a great deal of conversation.
I'll make a note to ask it tomorrow then. Right, so we have a question for you from Simon Cole, who asks, are desalination plants sustainable? And is it fair to say that Australia is past its natural carrying capacity because population has grown so much that we need to more desalination plants at the ready? So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Australian situation, but could you comment about desalination plants in general?
Yes, I am. So 2 points. The first is, I wrote a paper a while ago called Peak Water about the increasing limits that we are running up against as the populations, our economies have grown with a fixed hydrologic system. We're running into limits on availability and usability of freshwater resources, and Australia is a good example of that. And in my talk, I also described alternative ways of thinking about supply, and I mentioned desalination. The advantages of desalination, of course, is that 97.5% of the water on the planet is salt water. It's too salty to drink, it's too salty to grow crops. We know how to take salt out of water, and there are many thousands of desalination plants around the world that do that. And desalination has the advantage of being somewhat climate resilient. It doesn't matter if there's a drought in the whole local hydrologic system. It has the advantage of not making us take more water out of overstressed rivers and groundwater systems. But I would note that desalination plants are incredibly expensive. They're much more expensive, for example, than smarter water conservation and efficiency investments. They have an energy challenge. Desalination is very energy intensive. And if we're doing it with fossil fuels, that of course contributes in a negative sense to the climate problem. But where places are up against limits of water availability, where places have become very efficient, desalination does offer an opportunity if we're willing to do it in an environmentally sound way, if we use renewable energy, non-carbon-based energy, and if we have a good way of dealing with the very salty brines that are produced during the process. And that's a challenge that Australia has tried to deal with. Other parts of the world are starting to deal with it. So I think of it as an option. I think of it as a last resort, but it is an alternative strategy for supply.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was a really interesting talk, and for also taking the time to stay for the Q&A.